In 1859, Charles Darwin proposed that our species evolved from apes. Few people at the time took him seriously. The idea flew in the face of both religious conviction and our sense of pride that humans were a higher order, wholly separate from the animal kingdom. But over the years, the scientific evidence began to show otherwise. We share many features with apes that we don't share with most other mammals. For example, apes and humans have hands that can grip things by opposing the thumb to the four fingers, and we both lack claws and a tail. And in the past few decades, scientists have found even more compelling evidence. In 1974, anthropologist Donald Johanson unearthed in Ethiopia the bones of one of the missing links between apes and us, the famous Lucy, a 3.2 million-year-old ancestor of ours that walked upright. And in 1995, Meave Leakey, a member of the famed fossil-finding clan, discovered a new human ancestor in northern Kenya that walked erect 1 million years before Lucy. But the most persuasive evidence for the common ancestry of apes and humans comes from the molecules we share. In the 1980s, molecular biologists confirmed that we share 98.6% of our DNA, our genetic material, with chimpanzees. All the observed differences between chimps and us, the differences in brain size and body hair, our ability to talk and walk erect, our talent for art and developing technology and building civilizations, can all be ascribed to that tiny 1.4% difference in genetic material. Today, even while the search continues for man's ancient ancestors, other scientists are debating some of the ethical and philosophical questions that have been raised by science's discoveries. What does it really mean to be human? What's unique about our species? What turned us from a dim-witted ape man into the glorious thinking animal we are today? How much of our behavior is programmed into our genes? If we and chimps are so genetically similar, is it wrong to use them in medical research? If what sets us apart from chimps is our greater ability to think, why do we do stupid things like destroy our environment and wage war? No scientist has thought longer and harder about these issues than Dr. Jared Diamond, professor of physiology at UCLA Medical School, recipient of a MacArthur Genius Award, world-renowned ecologist, ethics advisor to zoos, ornithologist, rainforest adventurer, best-selling author, and proud father of twin sons. While most scientists today are specialists, spending their research careers on narrow problems, Dr. Diamond studies everything, from how New Guinea bowerbirds win mates and how pythons digest rats, to why humans seldom have twin births, and why deadly inherited diseases have not themselves died out. And yet there is method to his eclectic interests. Time and again, Diamond has managed to get outside the box and see connections between seemingly diverse subjects, all in an effort to better understand who we humans really are and what awaits us down the evolutionary road. I spoke with him recently in his home near Los Angeles. Jared, what I'm curious about is how you got interested in the sciences to begin with. Any experiences as a kid or where you grew up?
When I was 7 years old, I fell in love with birds. There was something about birds being able to get effortlessly from a tree to the next tree by flying without all the difficulties that people have that appealed to me. And also I was interested in identification and classification. So I became a bird watcher at age 7.
How did you actually start doing research with birds?
Almost by accident. The way I began to do research in birds resulted from a trip to New Guinea in 1964. Growing up in Boston and then being a graduate student in England, I had had a reasonably sheltered life. I had not gone to any wild, adventurous places. And I had a college classmate, John Terborg, who went on to become a great biologist. John had had a good deal of experience with camping in the outdoors, but John had not been to the tropics or wild places any more than I did. What is the wildest, most adventurous place in the world at all? New Guinea, all right? New Guinea also happens to be a great place for birds. It has the birds of paradise and bowerbirds.
Would the language present a barrier to doing work there?
In the world, there are about 6,000 languages. 1,000 of them are spoken in New Guinea. And every single one of those 1,000 New Guinea languages is confined to New Guinea. There's not a single native New Guinea language that is spoken anywhere except on New Guinea and its fringing island.
I mean, how do you get that number of languages in such a small place?
A couple of ways, Paul. One is the time depth of New Guinea. Humans have been in New Guinea for at least 40,000 years, and that's somewhat longer than anatomically modern humans have been in Europe. After all, we, you and I and our ancestors, replaced the Neanderthals beginning probably about 38,000 years ago in Western Europe. So time depth is one thing. Second thing is the incredibly rugged terrain. New Guinea is mountainous, but it's mountainous like a washboard. It's steep-sided ridges and then deep ravines, literally thousands of feet deep. So the average New Guinean, until the arrival of postmodern civilization, the average New Guinean didn't move more than 5 or 10 miles in his or her lifetime. Every village was in intermittent war with neighboring villages. So you get this marked isolation. And the typical language then in New Guinea is spoken for a distance of about 10 miles. But then the third thing, I would say that New Guinea is the norm. Most of the world probably had this linguistic diversity until the rise of agriculture and then modern states with high technology that then began to expand, wiping out the previous linguistic diversity.
So you're plopped down there to do research. They leave you off on the plane. How do you communicate with the people if you didn't know the language beforehand?
Interesting problem. There is a lingua franca in New Guinea because there are 1,000 languages. Lingua francas have developed. In Papua New Guinea, the eastern half of New Guinea, the lingua franca is a language called Pidgin English. It's a language that grew up spontaneously, wasn't invented. It developed during the early days of colonialism in the late 19th century as a spontaneous vehicle for communication between the colonialists, namely Germans and then English, and all these thousand New Guinea languages. Pidgin English has a vocabulary. The vocabulary is largely English, but there are also Polynesian words, German words, Portuguese words. The grammar is a grammar that evolves spontaneously, probably out of a genetic program in our mind.
Pidgin English, can you give me an example of that? What does it sound like?
Sure, Pidgin English. You, name belong you, Paul Hoffman. Now you, number one man, belong to Spelling magazine, name belong to Discover magazine. Now you got this pella black pella something, now white pella shirt and side long him. Long neck belong you got this pella long pella something, name belong him tie, long neck belong you. Okay,
I'm getting the gist, but
you're Paul Hoffman, you are the number one man, the boss of Discover magazine. You're wearing this black jacket and white shirt, and then this long piece of cloth that's called a tie. Lap lap is the pidgin for cloth. Many pidgin words, as you can hear, come from English. You belong. Other pidgin words come from Malay languages such as lap lap and lick lick. The grammar, it's a stripped down grammar. The grammar is actually about as complex as English grammar. It doesn't have tenses as English does.
So tell me about how you rediscovered a lost bird in New Guinea.
Probably the thing that I'm best known for in bird circles is my rediscovery of New Guinea's long-lost bowerbird. It was a wonderful, romantic event. Bowerbirds are family birds confined to New Guinea and Australia, and they're among the most remarkable birds in the world. The name bower refers to a structure built by males for the sole purpose of seducing females. Male bowerbirds build gigantic huts or towers. This is a bird the size of a robin.
And the huts are how tall?
Oh, the tower may be 9 feet tall. The tower is 8 feet in diameter.
And the bird's the size of a robin?
The bird is the size of a robin, but these structures weigh up to 150 pounds. The birds decorate them with butterfly wings, colored fruits, mushrooms, stones. The birds paint them. They may paint them black. They may paint them with fruit. They weave them together, and it's an example of what's called sexual selection. Namely, it's something that the males go through to woo females, because the female cruises around, inspects the bowers of the various males. Eventually, after a couple of months, she picks the male with the best bower, copulates with him, flies off, and never sees him again. And of course, this gets very, very anthropomorphic, I needn't tell you.
Men inviting women over to see their etchings, you mean?
That's right, and women selecting men based on sports cars and on qualities, signs of outwards wealth. Many of New Guinea's birds of paradise and bowerbirds were discovered in the last century not by museum collectors who could say, I collected this bird here, but instead by New Guinea natives who sold the birds to feather merchants in Indonesia who shipped the birds back to Europe. So the European museums would go over the imports of the Paris and London hat shops, discover previously undescribed birds of paradise and bowerbirds, describe them as new species but not know where they came from. Eventually, museums began going out to New Guinea themselves, collecting birds in different parts. And so the museum collectors figured out where these hat shop birds came from. By the First World War, all of the hat shop birds had been tracked down to their home grounds except for one. And that was one of which 4 specimens turned up in a hat shop in Paris in 1895, where Lord Rothschild of the Tring Museum in England recognized that it was a new species of bowerbird, magnificent bowerbird with a golden orange crest 4.5 inches long. That was 1895.
And no one had seen it since. In 1981, Diamond, using a helicopter, managed to find the long-lost bowerbird.
When I went into the jungle, the first bird that I saw was the female of the bowerbird. The first afternoon, I discovered the bower, and on the third day, I discovered the mating display at the bower, and that turned out to be the long-lost bowerbird. The reason why it had remained long-lost since 1895 is that this mountain range is just so remote.
So tell me about the experiments you did with poker chips in the bowerbirds.
Yes, the male bowerbirds decorate their bowers with colored objects, and each species decorates with characteristic colors. Certain species decorate in blue, others in red, others in gray, green, and white. And females evidently select males with which to mate by the decorations as well as by the form of the bower. Well, a question, suppose you find a bowerbird that decorates its bower preferentially with blue objects, or say preferentially with red objects. Is that because there are lots of red fruits and leaves available in the jungle and the bird is not being selected? Or is it because there are lots of different colors in the jungle and the bird, either because of a genetic program or because of a cultural tradition, has learned to select red colors? So I wanted to bring out some standardized objects. And I asked Marie, my wife, yeah, here's this problem. I want to bring out some standardized objects that I can get in different colors. Marie suggested poker chips.
I like this. This is how great science is done, with a minimum of equipment.
Particularly since it all has to get flown in by helicopter, I had to do something lightweight. At each bower then, I put 3 poker chips of each color with the numbers. And what happened, I then discovered in 2 ways. First of all, I discovered, when I came back to bowers, I found that poker chips were missing from some bowers, but from the numbers scratched into them, I saw that those poker chips were appearing at other bowers a quarter mile away. Secondly, I noted that poker chips that I placed near a bower, certain poker chips were being picked up and used to decorate the bower and placed in particular places. For example, in the Wandaman Mountains, the birds there loved blue poker chips. But when I myself decorated bowers with different poker chips, including white poker chips, the birds were disgusted and picked up the white poker chips and threw them away in the jungle. Conversely, in the Kamala Mountains, when I personally decorated bowers with blue and purple poker chips, the birds threw away the blue and purple poker chips into the jungle. So this experiment, it did several things. It showed that the birds had intrinsic color preferences. And it also showed that these color preferences differ from mountain to mountain, just as there's a characteristic Chinese art style and a characteristic Paris art style and a characteristic Navajo art style.
And how much of this is cultural and how much is genetic? Do we know?
We don't know, Paul. My hypothesis is that it's cultural. The reason I would guess it's cultural is that within the same species, mountain ranges 200 miles apart are decorated in different colors.
Here we have a bird that seems to have an aesthetic sense, that, seems to make art. I've often heard art is cited as one of the things that distinguishes us from other animals. And it almost seems that lots of things that have been cited historically that make us different, that, we could make tools and no animal could make tools, and then, we discover otters lying on their backs, cracking open oysters, I guess it is, or Jane Goodall finds that chimpanzees use twigs to get termites out of nests to eat. So other animals make tools. So is it just a continuous spectrum from other animals leading to us, or is there really some sharp difference between us and the animal world?
It has to be a continuous spectrum because we evolved from animals, and in fact our ancestors had animal-like behavior relatively recently. For example, humans had achieved anatomy that was relatively modern by about 100,000 years ago. But human behavior as of 100,000 years ago, at least as attested by the remains left behind at human sites, was still animal-like. Yes, there were stone tools, but they were crude stone tools, and chimpanzees, after all, used stone tools. All the interesting stuff, art, complex tools made of several pieces, does not appear until mostly within the last 40,000 years. You can see beginnings. There is some jewelry from 50,000 years ago. There are suggestions of complex tools and possibly jewelry as early as 90,000 years ago, but it's recent. And since it's recent, it means it must be traceable to animal precursors within the last 100,000 years. In fact, all of the things that we used to think of as distinctively human, language, art, tools, genocide, murder, all of those things are now attested in animals. So yeah, we've run away with those things. We've run away with art, and we've run away with genocide and murder, but they've got animal precursors. Certainly given bowerbirds, there are lots of biologists and anthropologists who would go into contortions in order to explain why bowerbirds do not have an aesthetic sense. They will say, there's no evidence for an aesthetic sense in bowerbirds, it's just a program. This is program behavior, stimulus response, to which I respond, well, what about humans? I know that I possess consciousness, but other humans, how do I know that that you and all other humans don't also possess just program behaviors? Yes, you have rather complicated stimulus responses, but I have no direct evidence that you possess consciousness or an aesthetic sense. In that same spirit, I'm willing to believe that bowerbirds possess the rudiments of an aesthetic sense. Now, they use it for clear purposes, namely seduction, but you just think of artists and musicians. Art in humans is also used for seduction. It has developed broader purposes, that's all.
Tell me about your work in physiology.
My work in physiology for a long time was work at the molecular level and on cells, that's to say on things that you can't see with your eye. And I was interested in mechanisms by which materials are transported across the membranes that surround cells and across the membranes of the intestine and the kidney. It's what could be called basic molecular and cell physiology. Half a dozen years ago, initially as part of my midlife crisis in my early 40s. For a long time, my scientific research went on in two fields, and I was a split brain with no connection between the two fields. Half of Jared did research out in the jungle on New Guinea birds. Half of Jared did research in the laboratory on molecular and cell biology. And eventually I got tired of being a human split brain. I wanted to bring the two areas together. So in the early 1980s, I began to bring my physiology into an evolutionary context.
Which means what exactly?
Evolutionary physiology would mean the insights into physiology that we can get by looking at our physiology as an outcome of natural selection. For example, we view our machines and our cars as results of design by engineers. And we discuss whether a machine is well designed and whether it's got a margin of safety. For example, with an elevator, the industry code says that the cable supporting an elevator has to be able to lift a weight 11 times what the placard on the elevator says the elevator can actually
I was
lift.
delighted when I learned that from you, because I used to stand in elevators always adding up the weight of all the people in them to make sure it wouldn't exceed that number.
That's
now
right.
I have to multiply it by 11. There's no chance it's going to fall.
The so-called safety factor of elevators is 11, and all machines have safety factors. Hot water heaters of houses, I discovered, have a safety factor of 1.05 because I had a series of hot water heaters, all of which broke down 5% beyond the duration of the warranty. So engineers design things consciously with safety factors. But our bodies also have safety factors. The difference is that the safety factors of our bodies are programmed into us by natural selection. For example, we have 2 kidneys. Do we need 2 kidneys? No, we do not. We can live perfectly normal lives on 1 kidney. Do we need a whole kidney? Not quite. We can live reasonably normal lives with about 2/3 a half a kidney. But once you get down to less than half of a full kidney, you cannot no longer lead a normal life. So that means our kidneys are over-designed by a factor of about 4.
We could use an extra heart, given the incidence of heart disease in this country.
Given the size of the heart, our heart is probably somewhat over-designed, but not much. Our intestine, we know, is over-designed by 50% because if you have cancer of the intestine, you can cut out half your intestine and lead a relatively normal life. But if more than half your intestine is cut out, you can no longer lead a normal life. In short, our body has safety factors. The safety factors, though, were designed into us by natural selection. Bodies that had too high safety factors, those bodies were too expensive and became outcompeted by cheaper bodies. An example I can give you relates to twin births. Women have 2 breasts, but there's nothing magic about 2 breasts. There are rodents that have 16 breasts. There are rodents with 12 breasts, 8 breasts, 4 breasts. What's the magic about 2 breasts? Well, if you look at hundreds of different mammals, if you compare the number of breasts with the number of babies, it turns out that the number of breasts or teats in a mammal, in any mammal species, is on the average twice the normal number of babies at a time. And it's equal to the maximal number of babies at a time. But we humans fit that perfectly because the normal litter size is 1, so our breasts are over-designed by a factor of 2. But the maximal normal litter size in humans is twins. Twins are not uncommon, up to 6%. Triplets were vanishingly rare until modern fertility drugs. So we fit what's called Aristotle's rule because it was discovered by Aristotle. Breast number in humans, as in squirrels and mice, equals twice the number of normal babies, and it's equal to the number of maximum babies.
I know that the birth of your twins, focused your attention on some physiological issues. And why is it that we don't all have twins all the time? I mean, it seems as if part of evolution gets us to pass on our genes. Wouldn't that be a way of doing it more effectively?
It would be a way of doing it more effectively if we had the physiological and biological equipment to rear twins. But number one, as the father of twins, I know very well that twin births are dangerous. There is
Dangerous to the mother now?
dangerous to the twins as well as to the mother. There is a much higher incidence of prematurity, of deaths, of prenatal damage and perinatal damage to twins. In fact, studies, now that one can track by ultrasound what goes on early in pregnancy, it becomes clear that a substantial fraction of pregnancies are twin pregnancies. We used to think that less than 1% of all births are twin births, but lots of you, I mean, you and most of our listeners, many of our listeners may be twins. The twin disappeared early in utero.
So what do we think the percentage is now?
I would not be surprised if multiple pregnancies are as high as 10%, maybe even 20%. Most of the extras are lost within the first week or the first couple of weeks, and the woman doesn't know it. Maybe there are slight symptoms or the passage of a little blood, but you wouldn't know it except for the ultrasound. So the reason that we're not equipped for twins is, again, I know very well, twins they're a big physiological drag. They demand lots of milk, and even nowadays, in the era of supermarkets and babysitters, twins are difficult. In the good old days of hunter-gatherers, it was almost prohibitively difficult for hunter-gatherers to rear twins to maturity. In fact, many hunter-gatherers, many peasant societies, if twins were born, they would smother one of the twins. So twin births in humans, although twin conceptions are probably rather common, twin births are maximally 6% in certain West African populations, and they're as low as 0.5% in Southeast Asian populations.
Because if you look at the rest of the animal world, I mean, you see again and again examples of animals where the litter size is rather large, whether it's dogs or pigs. Now, of course, they don't have the same investment in rearing their young that we do. Is that right? I mean, that we as a species have to spend more time and effort to raise a child. I mean, they're more helpless than, say, a horse that gives birth to a baby horse that's immediately up on its legs and running around.
That's right. Our infants are helpless. I mean, they've got to be carried for the. Basically, hunter-gatherers have to carry their kids for the first couple of years. They require to be fed. I mean, they're nursed for several years, but our kids have to have food brought to them until they're teenagers. Even chimpanzees, a young chimpanzee, once it's weaned, the young chimpanzee, the mother then brings the young chimpanzee to a place where there's good food, and the young chimpanzee gathers food for itself. But my kids, I mean, they're adorable and they're brighter than any chimpanzee, but they were utterly incapable of feeding for themselves at the age of weaning, and now at the age of 8, they are utterly incapable of gathering their own food. So yes, we have a long period of dependence. Our investment in a child is enormous compared to the investment of most animals.
What have modern genetic studies contributed to our understanding of how close we are to our closest relatives, chimpanzees?
That has been a real eye-opener. If you had asked anthropologists and biologists, say 20 years ago, what percentage of our genes are identical to those of our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, it was already recognized that the closest relatives of humans are the great apes, particularly chimpanzees and gorillas. But if you had asked any biologist, how similar are we to chimpanzees, you might have gotten answers, well, maybe our genes are 70% identical, maybe 50%, 30%. The answer finally came out in the 1980s, and it turns out that genetically we are 98.6% identical to the 2 species of chimpanzees.
Wow, so 1.4% difference in genes is what separates us.
A 1.4% difference, and that means that into that 1.4% difference is crammed all the genetic explanations for why you and I are now speaking English, and for why we grow our food rather than gather it in the jungle, and for why we use art for purposes in addition to seduction, et cetera, et cetera. But of that 1.4%, most DNA is junk anyway. And much of the 1.4% of our DNA that distinguishes us from chimpanzees has to do with the fact that we don't have much body hair, and that we walk upright. But my paucity of body hair does not explain why I now speak English and get my food in supermarkets. So it's a tiny fraction of 1.4% that explains language, art, murder, genocide, and all that stuff.
What implications does this have for the ethical treatment of animals or for animal research, as we find that, more and more we're not separate from the animals?
There are plenty of people who, on ethical grounds, are opposed to experimenting, doing medical experiments, lethal medical experiments on any animal. The flip side of it is that most of modern medicine has been gained by medical experiments on animals. The conquests of all the major diseases, all surgery. You don't start doing an experimental heart surgery. You get an idea, we'll cut the heart here. Do you take a human? No, you don't take a human. You work for years on animals. So most of modern medicine depends upon animal experiments. If animal experiments meant experiments on bacteria, I think few people would be bothered. Most animal lovers are not bothered by experiments on fruit flies. Most animal lovers are not bothered by experiments on mice, though some start to get bothered there. Lots of animal lovers get bothered by experiments on cats, dogs, and horses. And anyone who objects to experiments on animals will surely object to experiments on monkeys and great apes. And I can understand that reasoning. Your ethical argument against experiments on animals might be based, for example, on capacity for feeling pain. If it doesn't have capacity for feeling pain, that removes much of the argument for doing experiments. But monkeys and chimpanzees behave as if they have capacity for feeling pain equivalent to ours. I think they get depressed when their daughter dies. They scream with pain. It's a real dilemma because for the same reason that we object to doing experiments on them, for that same reason they are the best models for humans because genetically they are most like us. Let me put the dilemma in the most unpleasant way possible. Let's ask, would you accept medical experiments on severely mentally retarded people whose IQ is lower than that of chimpanzees and who have less capacity for feeling pain, much less capacity for social relationships?
And clearly not, right?
That we would be utterly horrified about it. Of all the things the Nazis did, perhaps the one that most horrifies us is the medical experiments in Germany and Japan in the Second World War.
Now, you had mentioned that other animals, murder, other animals commit genocide. I mean, is that somehow genetically programmed into us?
Well, I would say the following. Animals, any animal that we know that has the equipment for killing individuals of its own species, turns out to do so if you observe it for long enough.
Chimpanzees?
Chimpanzees, probably the most depressing and greatest shock of Jane Goodall's research career was her discovery of one troop of chimpanzees committing genocide over the course of a couple of years, wiping out another troop. Murder, really genocide, has been documented in hyenas, lions, wolves. Murder has been documented in peregrine falcons. If you get groups, then murder becomes genocide.
Things like sexual abuse, do we find those in animals?
Rape is widespread. Rape has been documented in orangutans, where it's easy because the male weighs double the female. Group rape has been documented in mallards. The fact that rape and genocide are widespread in animals and also widespread in humans suggests to me that there is a genetic predisposition for it. I'm not saying that there is a single gene, a murder gene, simply that we have a genetic predisposition. The explosive question is, what do you do about it? Many people, particularly many biologists, when they hear someone say, we have a genetic predisposition, they go ballistic and explode because that seems to them to say
it's natural.
It's natural, it's genetically programmed, you can't do anything about it. And therefore those biologists go to great lengths to try to refute the evidence for a genetic predisposition. That's utterly disastrous because the evidence for a genetic predisposition in many traits is increasingly overwhelming. In the case of murder or rape, if we accept that there is genetic predisposition towards aggression, doesn't mean that we just lie back there and accept rape and murder as a fact of human society. Of course not. We have laws against it. Human societies have been rather successful at curbing murder and rape. In fact, let's compare modern American and European society with the New Guinea societies that I'm used to. Violent deaths are far more common in New Guinea than they are in modern state societies. Particularly in the 20th century, we're used to thinking of genocide and murder as increasingly widespread today because of A-bombs, Hiroshima, the Nazis, and so on. But the fact is that even in 20th century Europe, the risk of people dying violent deaths is less than in tribal New Guinea. For example, the area of New Guinea where I worked in 1990, I happened to be there when a woman anthropologist was interviewing the women in the village to get their life histories. And she would ask a woman, who is your husband, what's his name, and who are your children? And the woman would say, which husband? Husband number one, husband number two, what happened to husband number one? Killed by husband number two who wanted me. What happened by husband number two? Killed raiding village, the next village. What happened to husband number three? Killed in the revenge raid. In short, violent deaths are much more common, much commoner cause of death in tribal societies than they are in modern states. So despite the awful genocides of the 20th century, which it's true they produced spectacular numbers of victims, but violent death is not nearly as high a risk today with state societies and with laws and with justice systems than it used to be. This is just a long-winded way of saying that although we have a genetic disposition, we have been very successful in curbing that genetic disposition.
Do we have a genetic disposition to destroy nature? Or we certainly seem to have a history of that, do we not?
We have a history of destroying nature within our power to do so. I don't see any evidence of a genetic predisposition there. It's instead that as we developed increasing technology, many of these destructive impacts it takes a long time to see what you're doing.
What are some examples? I mean, I know environmentalists or those of us who are naive often think of another time in which, native peoples were in tune with their surroundings and nature, and I know a lot of your work has been to bring out that that's not the case.
That has been one of the myths of archaeology and anthropology that has been exploded, especially by studies in the last decade or two. Many anthropologists, many people generally, have this idea that so-called primitive people, pre-industrial peoples, were paragons of environmentalist virtue who loved their environment and took good care of their environment, abstained from from damaging their environment, and it's only we wicked, nasty people since the Industrial Revolution, especially we vile people of the Western European tradition, who've been destroying the world. But in fact, archaeological studies have shown that basically whenever you get a human population expanding in a fragile environment with powerful technology, whenever people are capable of damaging their environment, they do so.
Like Easter Island?
Easter Island is the clearest case because Easter Island was so isolated, but there are many other examples. What makes Easter Island a beautiful example is that Easter Island, this Polynesian island 2,000 miles off the coast of South America, once it was settled by Polynesians from the west around 500 AD. It's so remote, even within Polynesia, that it became isolated. And there's no evidence that any more Polynesians came to Easter Island after that settlement 500 AD. But also because it's so isolated, not only were there no arrivals, once the Polynesians got there, there was nowhere they could go. Elsewhere in the world, wherever you see a society collapsing, collapse of the Roman Empire, collapse of Sumerian civilization, wherever a society collapses, the result is that the neighboring society moves in. Or as society gets weakened, the neighbors knock off the weakened society. And so you can't tell whether the collapse was really due to those neighbors, the barbarians who attacked the Roman Empire, or whether the collapse was really due to environmental reasons. Easter is a clean case because there are no confounding neighbors. In the case of Easter Island, it's a spectacular collapse, and it's clear that nobody else was responsible. From the pollen records on Easter Island, you can trace how following that settlement of around 500 AD, when the Polynesians arrived, the island was covered by a luxurious palm forest, probably with the biggest palm trees in the world, and giant tree sunflowers and tree daisies.
And they were all chopped down.
They were gradually chopped down until by 1600 AD, there were no more trees left. The trees of Easter Island were extinct. And with the end of the trees, that meant end of cover, protective cover, soil erosion, no more trees to go to sea to catch oceanic fish, no more trees to prop up the statues, to erect the statues. And so there was a population crash with less agricultural productivity. The population shrank from at least 7,000 down to 2,000, resorted to cannibalism. The biggest things that you can eat are now no longer porpoises that they couldn't get to see and hunt, but other people. And so Easter Island society collapsed in an epidemic of cannibalism.
We hear a lot these days about the alarmingly high rate of plant and animal extinctions. What percentage, if we can, put an estimate on this, are we responsible for?
The percentage of modern plant and animal extinctions that humans are responsible for is probably 99.9%.
99?
The reason I say that, Paul, is that one can estimate rates of extinction in the past, and they are more than 1,000 times less than current rates of extinction. That's one thing. Second, you can examine the causes of extinction of plants and animals that have either gone extinct within modern times or that are reduced and endangered today. And the causes of extinction are almost all related to humans. Sometimes it's direct shooting, particularly in the case of big animals.
Right.
More often it's indirect. In many cases, it's the result of pests that we introduced either intentionally or unintentionally. For example, of my twin sons, one loves frogs, and so we go out frequently into the Santa Monica Mountains here to look for native frogs and salamanders. But native frogs and salamanders are virtually confined to a few streams. Why? Because of introduced predators. We have intentionally introduced mosquito fish, crayfish, and bullfrogs, which just love native amphibians. And so native amphibians have disappeared from most native streams here.
And if we continue like this, what's going to happen?
If we continue like this, the interesting things are going to happen within the next century, within the next 50 years. It's easy to figure out why we only have a few decades. The number of people on Earth is now of the order of 5.5 billion, and the human population is doubling every 35 to 42 years. But humans are already utilizing, commandeering something like 40% of the available energy from sunlight. That's to say, of the energy from sunlight that is fixed by plants, 40% of that energy is utilized or commandeered
by people, right?
By people. But we are doubling in 35 to 42 years. So in 35 to 42 years, if we now commandeer 40%, in 4 decades, we will commandeer 80%, and in 6 decades, there won't be anything left to commandeer. That's one indication. Another indication is habitat destruction. The rate at which we're going now, the world's tropical rainforests, which are the richest habitat on Earth, and hold probably more than half of all species on Earth, tropical rainforests will be destroyed outside of some fragments left in Amazonia and Zaire by the year 2030.
It seems like, with the years you've cited, 2020, 2030, 2040, the clock is running out pretty rapidly.
Yes, it is, and of course the clock has run out rapidly in other areas. There are areas of the modern world where environmental destruction has taken place, and it's not going to be reversed. Haiti, for example. Haiti is deforested, and it's overpopulated. Haiti is not going to reverse itself. Somalia, you think of the areas that are the sites of war and unrest today.
Kuwait.
Haiti, Kuwait, Iraq, the foothills of the Himalayas, these areas that breed war. It's no accident that these are overpopulated areas of environmental damage. When you get too many people who are having to fight each other in dead earnest for disappearing resources, that's a predisposition for war. So when you ask what's going to happen to the world in the next decades if we don't rescue ourselves, it's not. The thing that makes this crisis so difficult to deal with, Paul, is that it's not like nuclear war. In the case of nuclear war, there is an abrupt holocaust that may end us. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they focused our attention because lots of people were killed in a few seconds. What we are risking now is an environmental holocaust. The risk of the nuclear holocaust, thank God, has receded in the last several years. But the risk of the environmental holocaust has increased. And yet the environmental holocaust does not wipe out 100,000 people in a few seconds. Instead, it gradually undermines standards of living. More and more people are starving. More and more people are living in damaged environments. More and more people are stimulated to war over shrinking resources.
So where is their hope?
The thing that distinguishes us from Easter Islanders and that distinguishes us from the ancient Sumerians and from the Mayans and all these past societies that destroyed themselves, the one sign for hope is that we have books, we have writing, and we can learn about things that happened in the remote past, including we can learn about past societies that destroyed themselves, and we can also learn about remote societies, geographically remote societies that are destroying themselves today. The Easter Islanders had no way to learn. We do have a way to learn. And so what I see really as the main cause of hope, the sole cause of hope in the face of this juggernaut, is our opportunity of learning from past mistakes and learning from mistakes happening in other countries.
Dr. Jared Diamond, thank you very much.
You are welcome.